Hello everyone, and welcome to After Alexander. Episode 28. Back to Syria. And so we come to the conflict that we've been building up to for a week, the First Syrian War, which will be the first of several conflicts ravaging the area as succeeding generations flex their military muscles in the region. So, when did this war begin? I've seen a variety of dates, but I'm going to trust Bevan on this one, because he came to the argument armed with a Babylonian inscription in the Seleucid calendar. According to Bevan, the stone stated that the war began in the year 38 of the Seleucid era. See episode 18 if anyone needs a refresher on that. Year 38, in this case, is interpreted by Bevan as referring to sometime between October 274 and October 273 BCE. Added to this, the modern history book by John Granger also opens hostilities in 274, so that's the year I'm going to go with. Now, a quick note on the war's impact on the succession here. The war was possibly the reason for Antiochus I's son Seleucus stepping into the limelight and being crowned joint king with his father in approximately 275 BCE. We don't know exactly when this happened, as I'll demonstrate in episode 30 with a wide range of possible dates listed by different sources. However, Seleucus may have been made co-king due to the very real danger that King Antiochus I might well die in battle. If this happened, the succession needed to be smooth. In Granger's eyes, the Seleucids had learnt from the chaos following the assassination of Seleucus I approximately 7 years before. As I'll discuss more in episode 30, given Seleucus the Younger's birth date, it seems unlikely he was brought to power any earlier than this given his young age at that time. Anyway, all of that aside, Antiochus I and Ptolemy II ultimately went to war. I should point out that different reasons are listed in different popular sources for the war breaking out. George Rawlinson's 1869 Manual of Ancient History, John Granger, and Edwin Bevan all cite Antiochus I's support of Magas as the cause for war, as I've mentioned before, although Rawlinson confusingly sets the date at 264 BCE, which I haven't seen anywhere else. With his marriage to Apama, Magas was supposedly pointing towards independence from Egypt. As such, Antiochus I's aim might simply have been to break Cyrenaica away from the Ptolemaic sphere of influence and give Ptolemy an enemy in his back. After all, as many will learn throughout history, fighting on two fronts is never a good idea. However, the Encyclopaedia Britannica states that an aggressive posture from Ptolemy II caused the conflict to erupt, while the 1911 Encyclopaedia Britannica entry for the Seleucids attributes it to the conflict over Hollow Syria, the province that had been a matter of contention since 301 BCE. In addition, Antiochus may have felt the war was an appropriate response to subtle aggression from the Egyptians. Taking all of this together, it seems to me that Hollow Syria and other simmering tensions may well have boiled over once the spark of Magas's marriage started the petrol burning. Right off the bat in terms of the conflict, Magas proved himself not to be as useful as some might well have hoped. As Antiochus I crashed in through Syria, which we'll deal with in a moment, Magas set his sights on Ptolemy II as well. However, almost immediately when the First Syrian War broke out, a rebellion sprang up in Cyrenaica, led by a Libyan nomad called Marmaridae. This uprising meant that Magas had to cancel his attacks on Ptolemy to deal with problems at home, which I can only imagine probably left Antiochus feeling a little short-changed. Not that Ptolemy II was able to turn this distraction to his advantage, as he immediately had to deal with a potential uprising by the Gallic mercenaries that we mentioned a few episodes ago. Ptolemy managed to quell this, and later used it as a propaganda tool to disguise the rebellion by Magas, papering over the cracks, as it were. As I alluded to above, Antiochus I would take the plunge and invade Syria, as commemorated in a Babylonian inscription. The inscription only mentioned that Antiochus crossed into Syria and that Egyptian troops withdrew in the face of his advance. This could supposedly either mean that Antiochus invaded first, or was responding to an invasion by Ptolemy II off the back of the Magas intrigue. In Antiochus's initial charge into the area, he managed to capture all the Egyptian-controlled regions of southern Syria and southern Anatolia. The Encyclopaedia Britannica, I should say, also places the alliance with Magas at this point, although most of my sources locate it at the beginning of the conflict. However, it's an alternate view to potentially bear in mind. Now, for this next phase of the war, we're going to have to cut back to Egypt and the marriage between Ptolemy II and his elder sister Arsinoe, which we mentioned last episode. Supposedly, this marriage in the late 270s stabilised the fluctuating and unstable Egyptian court, which allowed Ptolemy II to successfully campaign. It is accordingly at this point in the conflict the Seleucid triumphs stop. It is sometimes listed that, after they reversed the tide and took back their territory, the Ptolemies carried on and took the regions of Cilicia and Caria from the Seleucids. However, Bevan believes reports of this success to be exaggerated. Instead, he deemed it likely that key forts were taken over. To quote his 1902 book, The House of Seleucus, quote, "Our chief literary authority is, unfortunately, a court poet, whose phrases cannot be taken too severely. When Theocritus says that Ptolemy, internal quote, gives the signal to all the Pamphylians and the spearmen of Cilicia, to the Lycians and the warlike Carians, end internal quote, it need mean no more than that Ptolemaic garrisons were posted at strong points along the coast, places like Selinus and Coracesium, and that many of the cities of Lycia and Caria had been drawn into the Ptolemaic alliance." End quote. We can see some evidence of this conflict in the form of city names. Cilicia had a mix of both Seleucid and Ptolemaic settlement names. For example, although there are several Antiochs in the region, there are also a Cyrenaica and an Arsinoe. I'm not going to list every example, but we broadly see the same thing in Pamphylia and Lycia. In Lycia, Egypt had control over the harbour town of Patara, renamed as Arsinoe, which Bevan wrote probably implied control over the Lycian confederation of cities as well. From about 273 to 272 BCE, accordingly, Phoenicia and the Anatolian coast fell to Ptolemy II. The island of Samos had become an Egyptian possession sometime before 274, and acted as an important pit stop for the Egyptian navy. The city of Miletus would also fall to Egypt, despite the Seleucids trying to shore them up financially. Similarly, we can see Ptolemaic influence in the southern cities of Anatolia, such as Heraclea. In fact, the only reason that Ptolemaic influence isn't found in the north until much later was probably due to the timely action of Antigonus II, who now joined the war against the Ptolemies as per his marriage alliance with the Seleucids. His fleets held the line against Egypt, and he eventually won a crushing victory at Kos, which removed the unquestioned naval supremacy of Ptolemy II in the Aegean, and likely removed the pressure on Anatolia. I should mention that I don't know if this is a rival date for the later Battle of Kos, which we will mention in future episodes, given that there's a lot of uncertainty with when this later battle took place. However, I'm going to mention this conflict as provisionally a separate battle in this episode, given that the dates for the later Battle of Kos do not fit with this time frame. Some of the articles I've accessed claim that Magas declared himself independent at this point while his half-brother was looking eastwards. However, this would conflict with what I've said above and the casus belli we gave at the start of the episode. I suppose the bottom line is that there is a lot of uncertainty surrounding this conflict. That said, although we don't know the exact details of the war, we do know that it ultimately ended in a Ptolemaic victory. So, with that, let's examine what the situation looked like once the war ended in approximately 271 BCE. Some territory had changed hands along the frontiers, such as the city of Damascus and the coast of Anatolia, but on the whole not a lot had changed. Some sources which I accessed for this episode listed the war as a decisive Ptolemaic victory, but on the whole I tend to agree with the viewpoint that the Ptolemies perhaps made some gains but not a lot. According to Bevan's account, the Ptolemies were prevented from encroaching further into Anatolia north of the Latmian Bay by the naval defeat at the hands of the Antigonids mentioned above. Besides this, the coast which the Ptolemies now held was the area where the Ptolemies would have been stronger and able to repel a land invasion by the Seleucids. However, the main thing to note is that the Ptolemies ended up ahead and the Seleucids were on the back foot as a result of the war. One thing I will note is that the Seleucid military defeats may not have been the only factor in Antiochus I suing for peace. There seems to have been some sort of plague in the region of Babylon at this time, which might also have played a role. The important change was that, whenever exactly you believe Magas raised himself to the diadem, Cyrenaica now had a king again, for the first time since the end of the Batiad dynasty under Archesislaus IV in 440 BCE, which had ended when he and his son had been killed by a mob and Cyrenaica declared a democracy. The impact of this kingship under Magas would supposedly echo for at least 20 years, and his kingdom wouldn't be brought back into the fold of Egypt until 250 BCE, which we'll get to in time. From the Seleucid political point of view, there were now two kings, Antiochus I and his elder son Seleucus, which we'll cover in more detail in episode 30. The peace was an opportunity for both rulers to look away from their contentious frontier, as had happened with Seleucus I and Chandragupta back in the late 4th century BCE. As such, it seems at least possible to me that maybe this is why neither side pushed for a lot of territory. After all, they both had problems elsewhere, as we've seen with Magas for Ptolemy II. From a Seleucid perspective, Anatolia specifically once again needed Antiochus I's attention. So let's talk a bit about Anatolia. Essentially, the entire north of the peninsula had been lost to the Gauls and to the Anatolian dynasties, and it seems likely that the Seleucid policy of friendship towards Mithridates and Ariamnes, the son of Ariarathes II of Cappadocia, started with Antiochus I, as he may have recognised the impossibility of retaking their territories. This alliance can be seen in hints such as Ariamnes changing the language on his coins from Aramaic to Greek, and Mithridates chasing a Ptolemaic force back to the coast. Antiochus had managed to maintain his hold of the west coast, but the southern coast of the peninsula was now more in the Ptolemaic sphere of influence. Now, there were hostilities generally in the peninsula. For example, the settlement of the Gauls led to resentment and raids, while Bithynia seems to have been in constant fear that the Seleucids would try to reabsorb their kingdom as soon as their fortunes rose again. However, the question we're going to focus on from a narrative perspective is the city-kingdom of Pergamon, which would have needed Antiochus I's attention. As we've covered a few episodes ago, Pergamon was under the jurisdiction of a eunuch called Philoterus. Philoterus had once been a loyal servant of Lysimachus, but he'd turned turncoat during Lysimachus's final war with Seleucus in 281 BCE. Throughout his rule, the wily Philoterus sought to retain his friendship with the Seleucid dynasty. For instance, the coins of Pergamon under his rule depicted the head of the now deified Seleucus I. Bevan notes that, for his part, quote, Antiochus on his side probably thought it was wise to purchase the adherence of Philoterus by moderating his claims. End quote. This peace between the Seleucids and Pergamon allowed Philoterus to consolidate his power. At the start of Antiochus's reign, the city of Ptolemy owed Antiochus I 380 talents. Philoterus gave forward part of the money, thereby extending his influence over the city. His family no doubt benefited from this increased influence. His brother Attalus landed a marriage to Antiochus, the daughter of Achaeus and the niece of Antiochus I. We're definitely going to cover Achaeus and his family at some point when we get further into the story of the Seleucid dynasty, but suffice it to say that this marriage would have been an announcement that the Attalids were on the up and up. Now, a quick correction here from last time we discussed the Attalids. the Eumenes who became ruler of Amastris in 280 BCE was not the nephew of Philoterus, as I believe I said, but instead his brother. I suspect the reason for my mistake is that this brother called Eumenes had a son who was also called Eumenes. To avoid any future confusion as to which one is which, I'm going to call this nephew of Philoterus Eumenes I from now on, for reasons we'll see in just a moment. Philoterus would die in 263 BCE at the age of 80. His nephew and adoptive son succeeded him as ruler in Pergamon, and all future rulers with the exception of Eumenes II would depict him on their coins to honour the founder of the Attalid dynasty. With his accession, Eumenes I united the principality of Amastris, which he at this point already ruled over, with Pergamon. Perhaps predictably, the accession of this new young sovereign brought with it a breakdown in relations with the Seleucids. As Bevan writes, quote, "It was probably inevitable that the Seleucid king should not suffer this new power to grow up without first testing his ability to prevent it." End quote. So, next time we resume our narrative, we'll discuss Antiochus I's fresh attempt to intervene in Anatolia. However, that won't be for a few weeks, as next time we're going to discuss some of the building projects of Antiochus I that we otherwise wouldn't get to cover. Then, in 2 weeks' time, we're going to shine a light on the life and reign of Seleucus, the enigmatic co-ruler and son of Antiochus I. Then, after all that's over, we'll rejoin Antiochus I in Anatolia. Until next time, thank you all for listening. For any questions or comments, you can head over to the show's email address. Until next time, have a great week, everyone.